Hey, it's me again, and today we're going to talk about authentication and authorization for web applications and how we have implemented it at our hackerspace. Now, the background and context of this talk. In any organization, you will eventually have a bunch of different applications that you want to make work together. Now, some of the core questions that you will have there is how do you implement authentication and how do you implement authorization? So first of all, authentication verifies who the user is, and authorization determines what resources a user can access. Some of the key questions include: where are the password hashes stored? What software components see the plaintext password in transit? And where are the access controls stored? And of course, nowadays, you shouldn't forget about multi-factor authentication. Now, in most cases, you can possibly just offload it to an external party. Use Google accounts, Facebook accounts, GitHub, etc. But there are still many organizations where you need to self-host this kind of information. Now, for self-hosted setting, you essentially have Microsoft Active Directory. If you already have Windows-centric infra, just stick with Microsoft Active Directory. You could consider FreeIPA, but FreeIPA doesn't really support Windows domain joins. And we've got Samba 4, which is essentially open source implementation of Active Directory server-side components. And the common denominator between all of these three is the lightweight directory access protocol, which essentially is a phone book protocol. So with LDAP, you can look up user information, you can look up computers, you can look up groups. Now, in case of all of these three, the password hashes are stored on the servers where the software runs, and the access controls usually are implemented as groups. Now, of course, LDAP is a really old protocol, so it doesn't know anything about web. And the question is, how can we make web applications interact with a LDAP server? Many web applications support the so-called LDAP bind authentication. In this case, the user approaches your web application directly, enters username and password there, and behind the scenes the web application takes the password, goes to your Active Directory, asks Active Directory, is this password the correct one? And then the Active Directory gives you a yay-nay signal. Now obviously the problem with this approach is that the application sees the plaintext password, and if the application is infected with malware or something like that, you could have your password easily compromised. So for these reasons, at some point, Microsoft integrated Kerberos with Active Directory, and they implemented Active Directory single sign-on, which in the context of web is known as SPACE.EE. Now, the problem with the Active Directory infrastructure is that it was designed for use in internal networks, so it's not really usable for public internet. And this is the reason why it's crossed off here. Now, when we talk about more modern options, we've got OpenID Connect, which is the OAuth 2.0 successor. So you've got loads of different OpenID Connect identity providers. These are essentially pieces of software that deal with handling the password. And the identity provider essentially gives the web application a claim that this user is who they claim to be. Now, the cool thing about OpenID Connect is that the application doesn't see the password, and during authentication stage, user is just redirected to the identity provider software, and then they get redirected back to the web application. And one of the problems I noticed with OpenID Connect is that there is no handling of authorization information. And we've got also fourth option that I identified. This is the reverse proxy companion. So we've got a couple components here. We've got Authelia and Pomerium. And Authelia essentially works with your reverse proxy. It will intercept the traffic before it hits the web application. If necessary, it presents the user a login dialog. And behind the scenes, it can do all sorts of authentication steps. In our case, we've got the Samba 4 running in the background. Authelia talks to Samba 4, authenticates there. If necessary, presents the user with additional authentication steps, like for multi-factor authentication. And once the user has passed all the checks, they get redirected back to the actual web application. Now, Authelia also recently added OpenID Connect identity provider features, so you can use it as OpenID Connect identity provider as well. But for simpler applications, the remote user approach works very well. Many applications support it, and you don't really have to think about OpenID Connect at all. So this is how we have implemented authentication at our hackerspace. We are running Gitea, Nextcloud, and Wiki.js. These are some of the applications that support LDAP out of the box. They're quite easy to integrate with the Active Directory, and everything pretty much works as you would expect. Now the difference here is that some of the applications make use of LDAP groups and some of them don't. For Nextcloud, there's full support for LDAP groups. You can share a file in Nextcloud with a group of people, and the group members are defined by Active Directory. Wiki.js, on the other hand, doesn't know anything about groups. They have it on the roadmap to add groups. And Gitea doesn't support groups either. And I would say in case of Gitea, it's sort of justified, because the source code repository accesses probably need pretty fine-grained control anyway, and it doesn't make sense to define them in an Active Directory. On the other hand, probably in a bigger organization, you would have a group of developers defined in Active Directory, and it probably would be easier to manage access controls if they would be fetched from Active Directory. Now, on the other side, we've got applications that are integrated with Authelia. So, first of all, we've got the HA proxy here with the Lua scripts from Authelia. And the Lua scripts, what they do is that they intercept the traffic before it hits the application. So let's say user wants to read webmail. If the user hasn't authenticated, they will get redirected to Authelia. Authelia performs the authentication check against Active Directory, returns to the Lua script with a success signal, and once that happens, user is presented with the actual webmail. We do something similar for Jenkins, and we do something similar for Etherpad. In case of Etherpad, Etherpad doesn't really know anything about users. We just use the Authelia to protect certain pad prefixes, so they would be restricted to members only. On the other hand, we've got here FreeScout, which is pretty tightly integrated with LDAP, but we use Authelia to authenticate the access to FreeScout, and FreeScout itself doesn't do any authentication on behalf of the user. We've got also the member site. The authentication again is performed by Authelia here, and the integration with LDAP concerns only the access controls and stuff like that. So here I've put together a feature matrix for some of the applications that we use. This is actually just to illustrate some of the trends in the software development. Your old school web applications, they tend to really do everything by themselves. So they've got LDAP support integrated. Nowadays, they also include OpenID Connect. They tend to implement LDAP group access. But the problematic area is here. They also try to do integrated multi-factor authentication. Now, what is the problem with this? Is that for every application, you would need to set up a different registration for your security keys and your one-time passwords. It means that when you lose your security key, you need to revoke the key in each one of those applications. And the same goes for losing your mobile phone where you run your Google Authenticator or YubiKey Authenticator. The problem with the one-time passwords is that for every application you will have a separate registration entry in your OTP application. Now, on the other hand, we've got here Harbor, which is your modern implementation of a Docker registry. Yes, it does support LDAP, but it also supports OpenID Connect out of the box, and it supports LDAP groups. On the other hand, it does not support multi-factor authentication out of the box, and the expectation here is that the OpenID Connect identity provider is the piece that will do the multi-factor authentication for Harbor. Jenkins, on the other hand, is a very old application. Everything is implemented as plugins. Fortunately, regarding multi-factor authentication, it seems that the statement is the same, that they don't want to include it in the application and this should be handled elsewhere. Now, one of the other issues with Authelia is that it will break the apps, your mobile apps. If we would do remote user header-based authentication with Authelia, that will probably break the Nextcloud app. We have already broken the FreeScout because we do use remote user header authentication for FreeScout, but I'm pretty sure that now the app doesn't work anymore. And then we've got the member site, which is used to manage the members of a hackerspace. You could call it a core business logic application. And this is a in-house development. So we do not use LDAP for authentication. We rely on Authelia there. I didn't want to add this complexity into the application. We do not support OpenID Connect because, first of all, this application is designed only for us, for our use. And Authelia already works good enough for us, so I don't see any reason to add OpenID Connect support. We've got LDAP group support, but this is to fetch the access controls from Active Directory. And of course, we didn't implement multi-factor authentication separately there. We just rely on Authelia, that Authelia provides it for us. I hope this explains the decisions we made for our in-house development. I hope this also helps you to navigate in the crazy world of authentication in general. There's lots of stuff going on, and some of the stuff gets pretty complex. So I hope this serves as a guide for somebody who wants to implement decent authentication and authorization within a self-hosted infrastructure. So if you liked what you saw, subscribe to our channel. There's more content coming up on authentication as well. I could go in detail about the user account lifecycle in our hackerspace. So we didn't talk about onboarding a new member, offboarding a member, especially in the light of GDPR. You need to have in place mechanisms to clean up after a user leaves your organization. Also, we didn't talk about file servers and SSH and how to do single sign-on there. It's pretty easy if you know what you're doing. So there will be another talk on that. If you would want to know more about our hackerspace, check out our website, SPACE.EE. If you think you found a security issue, reach out to info@SPACE.EE. We'd like to thank Startup Estonia and Credex for supporting the creation of these videos, and we're hoping to make many more like this.